This is Dr. Michael Cameron, and this is Registered Behavior Technician Modules 17 and 18. The specific strand that this comes from in terms of the Registered Behavior Technician task list are D02 and D03, and both of these areas are from the behavior reduction category. The specific titles for these presentations, first connected to D02, I'll be describing common functions of behavior. This will be a refresher for you. We've already reviewed the common functions of behavior, and what I'll be doing here is provide a bit of a refresher. And then the second title is to implement interventions based on modifications of antecedents, such as motivating operations, establishing operations, and discriminative stimuli, also referred to as SDs. And that is from strand D03. The duration of the presentation is 75 minutes. There'll be a competency-based quiz at the end and 5 questions. And then with respect to your demonstration recommendations, at the conclusion of this module, you should ask your BCBA supervisor to provide you with some examples of how they have used antecedent-based interventions in their own clinical practice. This will be interesting for you to hear another clinician talk about how they've solved problems, clinical problems, using antecedent-based interventions, and then practice identifying potential antecedent-based interventions for a person, and then demonstrate ultimately your own ability to implement antecedent-based intervention strategies. Within these modules, I'll be synthesizing a lot of information that you've already covered in previous modules. I'll be talking about case studies. These are authentic case studies that you'll be hearing about. These are real situations that have been encountered in my own clinical practice. They're real solutions and real results. Fortunately for the case studies that I'll be presenting, they're all favorable results. But I'll be discussing the FBA process. I'll be talking about strength-based assessment and talking about preference assessment and reinforcer assessment and skills assessment. So a lot of the information is being synthesized for you here, and you'll see how everything is integrated and allows for an intervention to occur as a result. So I'm excited, very excited about this module and to discuss these case studies with you. So the specific goals for Module 17 and 18. First, to provide a refresher on the primary functions of behavior. And then second, to discuss the development of interventions for behavior change. We've talked a lot already about behavior intervention plans and the development of behavior intervention plans. Now we'll be talking about the specific interventions that are part of a BIP, behavior intervention plan. However, the conversation for today will be focused on antecedent interventions, antecedent control strategies as well. So for that reason, I'll be defining and discussing both antecedent control and antecedent interventions. And there's a difference between the two. Next, I'll be defining and describing what's referred to as contingency-dependent stimuli, what we also refer to as discriminative stimuli, or SDs. And then I'll be talking about and defining and describing what's referred to as contingency-independent stimuli, and that's what we know to be as establishing operations. So contingency-dependent stimuli and contingency-independent stimuli will be the topic of conversation. Now, by way of quick review, I just want to remind you of many other things that we've already discussed in these modules. We've talked about the functions of behavior, and in a number of modules earlier, I gave you a mnemonic device, SEAT, to remember the primary functions of behavior, the reasons why behavior occurs, the causes of behavior. So some people engage in problem behavior, for example, as a result of the sensory consequences that it produces. And that's what we refer to as automatic reinforcement. So a person's motivation can be based on and driven by the sensory consequences and the automatic reinforcement. Other individuals, or actually this can occur in one person. A person can engage in behavior for multiple reasons. But the second reason could be because the person is trying to escape or avoid some set of circumstances. The third reason is for attention. And one of the things I mentioned in one of the earlier modules is that attention can take the form of verbal behavior from another person, nonverbal behavior, text-based communication can be a form of attention. Physical contact can be a form of attention. So when I talk about attention, I just want to make sure that you have a broad view of the kinds of things that people seek with respect to attention. So verbal behavior, nonverbal behavior, text-based behavior, physical contact with another individual. And then the final function is what's referred to as tangible. People engage in particular behaviors because they're trying to acquire tangibles in their environment. So once again, SEAT, seat, primary functions, sensory, escape, and avoidance, attention, and tangible. And these are the maintaining consequences, the causes of behavior. And I want you to remember, I've said this before, but what we call a problem behavior is often a solution to a problem for a person engaging in that particular behavior. And that the aberrant behaviors that you see, whether it be tantrum behavior or various forms of non-compliance or property destruction or various forms of inappropriate verbal interactions. These aberrant behaviors can be a form in and of itself of a language. It's a way of communicating. A person can use the behaviors, use the problem behavior, use the aberrant behavior as a way of communicating to you. And that's one of the things I want to make sure you keep in mind at all times. It does serve a function, and many times it's communicative in nature. So the other thing I want to remind you of is that we also gather a lot of very important information about what motivates a person through what's referred to as a preference assessment. We spent a lot of time in one of the earlier modules talking about all the different forms of preference assessments that you can conduct. From interview forms, using rating scales, for example, to doing some kind of evaluation of an individual in a free operant situation as well. And we also talked about reinforcer assessment. The difference here is that a reinforcer assessment, the outcome is the validation of a stimulus functioning as a reinforcer for the individual. So there's validation here. The preference assessment is information that suggests that possibly it could be a reinforcer, but you know as well as I do at this point that a reinforcer has to be defined by its effect on behavior, and a reinforcer will increase behavior. So the reinforcer assessment demonstrates exactly that you're capable of reinforcing an individual, presenting a stimulus, for example, in terms of positive reinforcement, and deliberately accelerating a behavior as a result of that arrangement. The other thing I want to describe and remind you of is the functional behavior assessment process. And as part of that process, we often do what's referred to as the ABC analysis, antecedent behavior consequence analysis. We've discussed that. You're documenting the antecedents, you're documenting the behavior that occurred, and then the consequences that followed. That's information that your board-certified behavior analyst may ask you to collect as a result of going through the FBA process. We also talked about the scatter plot analysis and the setting events checklist, and you're going to see a lot of that information show up here in my case studies. I'm pulling it all together for you within these modules. We've also talked about skills assessment. It could be the VB map, it could be the Vineland, it could be a social skills assessment, for example. And then we've also talked about the prioritization of goals and objectives for an individual. So I'm reminding you of that because a lot of that information is going to show up in the case studies that I'll be presenting to you today. We also discussed the value and the importance of the interdisciplinary team, building rapport with those individuals as well. If you're going to work on behalf of an individual, whether it be a child or an adolescent or adult, you will have to collaborate with multiple other people. It is a collaborative effort. There's no one person, there's no one discipline that really solves problems for an individual. It really does require the talent and the caring and the expertise of an interdisciplinary team in order to do that. And if you are going to be a valued member of that team as a registered behavior technician, then it'll be critically important for you to build rapport with those individuals and to build a relationship with those individuals. There's got to be mutual respect. There's got to be a shared vision as well in terms of what you're looking to achieve with an individual. So I just want to remind you of all these pieces because I'm priming you right now because you're going to see all of this information show up in authentic case studies, real situations that have been presented and solved as a result of clinical practice, specifically my clinical practice. What I'm hoping to do at this point for you as a registered behavior technician candidate, you will, throughout your career, build your own repertoire of skills. You will learn how to use various assessment strategies and assessment techniques. You'll learn how to use FBAs, for example. And one of the things I've mentioned before is that you may go on with respect to your academic career and your academic trajectory, and you may go on to earn a baccalaureate degree and become a board-certified assistant behavior analyst, and then perhaps a master's degree and be a board-certified behavior analyst, or maybe a doctoral degree and become a board-certified behavior analyst at the doctoral level. That is what's in front of you in terms of a career and academic possibility. What I'm trying to do here for you as a registered behavior technician candidate is to begin building your skill, building your repertoire of things that you can do, interventions that you can use for the purpose of assisting and guiding another individual. And that is what this is all about. Remember that the field of applied behavior analysis is centered on and concerned about working with individuals and producing socially significant outcomes for that individual. So as an interventionist, what I want you to do is to build your repertoire of skill and build your own clinical practice. And this is a starting point. You'll be learning about many antecedent interventions that you can use. But for those that I cover, there are many, many more to match and to enhance your skill and your own repertoire. So I encourage you to continue your education along the line of learning about various types of intervention strategies. I'm first going to begin with what's referred to as antecedent-based interventions. And I'm going to clarify in terms of what antecedents are. It can be any number of things, and you know this already from the conversation we've had in terms of ABC analysis, antecedent behavior control. Antecedents can take any number of forms. There's any number of things that can occur as a precursor to a behavior. And then there's any number of things that can occur as a result of the behavior, various number of consequences. But what are antecedents? That could be events that occur. I can look outside my office window right now, and I can see some kind of event going on the sidewalk. Perhaps it's somebody walking their dog. Perhaps it's a police officer pulling somebody over on the side of the road. And I live in Los Angeles, and that happens a lot. So there are events. I can just look out my window right now and see events occurring right outside of my office window. That could be an antecedent for me. That could certainly be an antecedent event. People are antecedents. People that come into to a room, for example. You know as well as I do that you've been affected as a result of somebody entering a room. Perhaps you went to a party, for example. Perhaps you went to dinner at somebody's house, and somebody that you did not expect to see showed up. And maybe that person that you did not expect to see is not somebody that you particularly wanted to see. Or conversely, maybe that person that you did not expect to see is somebody that you were just elated to see. So events can function as antecedents. People can function as antecedents. Things in the environment, various forms of stimuli can function as antecedents. The time of day can function as an antecedent for individuals. Your physical environment, the presence of something or the absence of something, somebody scolding you or teasing, or you being told to complete some kind of difficult assignment. All of these things can function as antecedents to behavior. So at this juncture, I want to go into more detail in terms of the antecedents, because there are some antecedents, for example, that will fall into the category referred to as contingency-dependent stimuli. So some antecedents will take on control over your behavior. And it will take on control over your behavior as a result of the consequences that have been arranged. So just by example, this word right down here, Google. Back in 1998, 1999, that word Google, that image right here on the screen in front of you, meant nothing to you or anybody else, quite frankly, in the country. Google meant nothing. But as a result of the presentation of that stimulus, this colorful word Google, and as a result of its continuous and repeated presentation, and then our ability to press a button and to do an internet search. It functions as a search engine, and as a result of coming in contact with consequences as a result of doing that, perhaps reinforcing consequences. Maybe there's things that are positively reinforcing. I do a Google search, and I do that on an individual, and I find out information about the individual, and I find that information very reinforcing. So as a result of the presentation of the stimulus, Google, which initially meant nothing, and as a result of the consequences that followed in the presence of that word, Google, and as a result of those consequences being reinforcing to us, what happens is that this word Google then takes on what's referred to as stimulus control. It acquires control over our behavior, and it functions as a discriminative stimulus, also referred to as an SD. So this kind of stimulus, the word Google, falls squarely into the category of a contingency-dependent stimuli. Why? Because its power depended on the contingencies. It depended on the consequences. It depended on reinforcing consequences that occurred. The word Google has become a noun in our vocabulary. It's become a verb in our vocabulary. We always say that we're going to Google something. We're going to Google a person or Google some information that we're looking to acquire. So that word, Google, that colorful word, has become, for us, a discriminative stimulus. Why? Because it signals the availability and it increases your chance of getting something. Increases the chance of getting information, valued information that you want. Why? Because it's a word that's associated with a search engine. If you press on the link and you begin searching for information in the presence of the word Google, then that has acquired for us stimulus control over your behavior. So once again, this is a contingency-dependent stimulus, the term Google. It acquires its power as a result of the consequences that follow. Once that occurs, we refer to as an SD. There's other SDs in our lives. They're all over the place. If I'm driving down the highway, for example, and I notice that I'm about to get on a toll road here in California. They always catch you by surprise. And I realize as a result of seeing the sign that says toll road, that I don't have any cash in my pocket, and perhaps it's a cash-only highway toll that needs to be paid. So I'm looking off on the side of the road, and I see a big sign for a gas station. Let's say it's Shell, and right under the sign it says ATM. Now, those three letters, ATM, have acquired stimulus control over our behavior. Why? Because it's become an SD. Why? Because in the presence of those three letters, ATM, we're able to pull over to the side of the road, go to the machine that has those three letters on it as well, ATM, and acquire cash, something that we need in the moment. So as a result of that consequence, in the presence of those three letters, ATM, and as a result of that repeated pairing of ATM and the consequence that followed, the ATM, the three letters, acquires stimulus control over our behavior, becomes an antecedent, signals the availability of something, what? Cash, and signals the chances of us getting something, what? Cash. Therefore, it becomes an SD. It's a contingency-dependent stimulus. So those are the terms that I want you to recall. Now, one of the things that's important to note is that there are some antecedents that show up in our lives and in the lives of other people that set the stage or trigger a challenging behavior. So it's an antecedent that's associated with perhaps unfavorable things happening. This is something we don't want. So an antecedent can be presented, and it can trigger challenging behavior or aberrant behavior. While other antecedents, such as the ones I just talked about, the word Google, the three letters ATM, those antecedents set the stage or trigger appropriate behavior, something we definitely want. So for the ATM, driving off the highway, taking the exit ramp, going to that machine, getting cash from that machine, all appropriate behavior, right? Looking at the word Google and just doing the search as a result, using the function, the search engine function with the term Google, and that's appropriate behavior. Those are the kinds of things that are helpful. We want that kind of behavior. But for other people, there are antecedents, for example, that set the stage or trigger challenges. And those are things that we need to focus on. Because if that's operating in somebody's life, then we want to change those circumstances for those individuals. We want to ensure that we manage those antecedents in some way. So it's not triggering challenging behavior. And that's exactly what this module is about, is those things that we can do in order to change the circumstances for an individual as a result of changing the antecedents for that individual. One of the things that I've done previously is to introduce you to Dr. Ted Carr. I mentioned previously that he's somebody that I have a tremendous amount of respect for, a great researcher, great interventionist, a great psychologist. And one of the things that he taught me a long time ago was about what he referred to as a tripartite model, three-way model. And with respect to antecedent manipulations, he's indicated that we can teach somebody to avoid things. We can manipulate antecedents so that the circumstances are mitigated for an individual, or we can work with the individual and help them cope with the presentation of antecedent stimuli that may provoke challenging behavior. So I've always remembered that, his tripartite model: avoid, mitigate, cope, and manipulate antecedents to try to achieve those outcomes. So with that said, I'm going to begin this process of describing to you some case studies. So I'm going to give you, the format that I'm going to follow is I'm going to give you some background on the individual. I'm going to give you the specific scenario for that individual. I'm going to discuss on point the strategy that I put in place for the individual, and then the data that were collected as a result of the strategy. And these are real case studies, these are real stories, and they are successes, and will serve as a great teaching vehicle for us right now. So here's the first story. It involves a middle-aged student, his name's Anthony, fictitious name, whose behavioral presentation worsens, meaning that he begins using a loud voice, he begins using expletives in the school cafeteria, and this information was determined by a scatter plot analysis. So through the scatter plot, we were looking for the target behaviors, the expletives, the loud voice, he became very behaviorally dysregulated within the cafeteria. And we picked that up through the scatter plot. We found that there was a predictable time of day when these behaviors would occur. And that was happening during the school cafeteria time. He also had a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and he would fall into the category of what we can refer to as high-functioning autism. Okay, so here's the scenario. The onset of his challenging behavior, that is the loud voice, use of expletives, was correlated, as we determined that by an ABC analysis, with the presence of a specific female peer, and I'll just call her Gracie, also a fictitious name. So recall at the beginning of this module I said that antecedents can take the form of people and people being present. So Gracie was clearly an antecedent. She came right before the unleashing of Anthony's expletives and his loud voice. Anthony liked to be social with Gracie, and we picked that up as a result of the FBA process. We made a determination that the function of his loud voice, the function of expletives, was to gain attention, and to gain attention from a very specific person. Actually, there were a few people that he would do that with, but he was seeking attention from individuals, and Gracie was one such individual. And we picked that information up from the FBA. Okay, so far we've got the scatter plot analysis that was used, we've got the ABC analysis that was used, the FBA was conducted, and we're learning all these things. What we found was that Anthony had very unsuccessful attempts that were very cumbersome as well in terms of his social engagement with Gracie, and he was often rebuffed by Gracie, and we got that information from the FBA process as well. The reason he was rebuffed by Gracie oftentimes is because somebody taught him that when he wanted to approach a female that he was interested in, then he should tell knock-knock jokes to that person. And I don't know about you, but to be in a middle school and to approach a female telling knock-knock jokes is probably not a great way of generating some kind of social contact with that individual. And sure enough, the knock-knock jokes were highly annoying, and it was something that Gracie very much disliked. And as a result, she would just reject Anthony's attention and any kind of initiation or attempt at all to be social. We also found through a social skills assessment that Anthony had some pretty significant social skill deficits that we had identified. Okay, so there's the background, there's a scenario. We've got Anthony that is very interested in Gracie. Gracie has a history of rebuffing him. So at this point, anytime Anthony goes into the cafeteria and Gracie enters in the cafeteria as well, we get the unleashing of the expletives and the loud voice. That's an antecedent that needs to be adjusted. So one of the things that I want to describe as an antecedent intervention strategy is what's referred to as eliminating the antecedent. But for Anthony and for Gracie, this was just a bridge plan for us. We needed to gain control over this behavior fairly rapidly because Anthony was becoming very problematic in the cafeteria. Other students becoming extremely upset. Some students became very protective of Gracie, and Anthony was running into a lot of trouble as a result of that. So as an antecedent strategy, one of the things I'm going to remind you of here is Dr. Ted Carr once again. Avoid, mitigate, or cope. So that was our starting point. And one of the things I want to emphasize right here is that it was only a starting point. What I'm about to tell you was done on a very temporary basis. And then I'll get into the long-term strategy. The starting point for us was to change Anthony's schedule for lunch. That way we could completely avoid Gracie entering into the cafeteria and the behaviors occurring. And that worked for us. As soon as we changed Anthony's lunch schedule, then he went at a different time and didn't have any difficulty at all. Why? Well, because Gracie was not coming into that area and into the cafeteria. So we essentially avoided. We completely avoided everything. But that doesn't solve the problem, does it? Not at all. It was a temporary measure. It was just our way of making sure that Anthony wasn't becoming stigmatized or being seen in an undignified way, which was very important to us. We wanted to shift all of that for him, so we decided to just change his lunch schedule because it wasn't acceptable for us for him to present himself in an undignified way. So we did that. The other thing that we did was a preference assessment on Gracie. Not Anthony, but Gracie. And here's why. We got her consent. We wanted to find out about her interests, who she was, what her interests were. And what we found as a result of doing that with Gracie is that she had a fascination. She was an artist. She was a very gifted artist. She had a fascination with a form of painting that's referred to as pointillism. And here's a good illustration of pointillism. It is a painting that is consisting of many, many, many fine points created by the brush from the painter. So this is a fascination for her. Pointillism and art in general was something that she was extremely interested in. Why do we want to know that information? Okay, because of this. If we want Anthony to be successful in terms of his social interactions with Gracie, then he's probably going to have to talk about something that Gracie's interested in. Not something that he's interested in necessarily, something Gracie's interested in. So we use a software program. It's called Kidspiration, and it's essentially a mind mapping or idea mapping. It's a visual way to think and write. But it was our way of teaching Anthony a lot of different things. So what we did is that we taught Anthony about pointillism. We taught him all about pointillism. We taught him about the history of the painting form. We taught him about artists that were known for their work in pointillism. We talked about the historical roots and the years in which it was a very popular form of painting. We taught him about the materials that were needed in order to create the particular art form. Why do we do that? Because of this. Anthony was interested in speaking with Gracie. He really wanted social contact with Gracie. So in order to create social contact with Gracie, we taught him about things that Gracie was interested in. We taught him about pointillism. And that was our starting point. Then we began using what is referred to as behavioral rehearsals. So we began rehearsing with Anthony this conversational exchange about pointillism, what we also refer to in the field of verbal behavior as interverbals. We taught him to use interverbals and to respond back and forth with another person and talking about pointillism. At that point, we are primed to reintroduce Anthony and Gracie, and that is exactly what we did. And sure enough, what happened was that the next time that Anthony saw Gracie, and this was with her permission, he engaged with her in a conversation about the very art form that she found very interesting, and that was pointillism. From there, we just relied on the natural occurring consequences. We didn't have to arrange any kind of reinforcer because it was automatic. It was immediately reinforcing to Anthony to have Gracie respond with such enthusiasm and with such interest that the natural consequences took over. And this is something that we want to do when we're talking about the generalization of skill and the generalization of an effect. We want to rely on naturally occurring consequences. So this is exactly why we did this. What behavior did we do our data collection on? Well, we collected data on functionally equivalent replacement behaviors, that is interverbals, and conversational exchanges having to do with pointillism. And we also took data on the target behaviors, use of loud voice, use of expletives as well. Incidentally, we were able to teach Anthony a discrimination about loud voice versus soft voice, and we did that using what's referred to as a voice light, which gives immediate feedback in terms of the voice volume, and we taught Anthony to control the volume of his voice by receiving immediate feedback from a voice light mechanism. So there it is. Here's a case study that started off with the presentation of an antecedent, Gracie. Gracie's presentation triggered for Anthony the unleashing of expletives and a loud voice. It became stigmatizing. It became very problematic for Anthony. Our strategy was initially and temporarily to eliminate the antecedent. What did we do? We changed the schedule, changed his lunch schedule. We needed to correct things fast. Gracie was becoming very intolerant. Other students were becoming very intolerant. Anthony was being stigmatized. He was being made fun of as a result. So this was a tremendous problem. As a result of preference assessment, we learned a lot of things about Gracie with her consent. We found out about her interest in pointillism. We then took that information and used software called Kidspiration to teach Anthony all about pointillism. We did rehearsals, referred to as behavior rehearsals, and we relied on the naturally occurring consequences. Success story, all as a result of antecedent interventions that we put in place. Okay, here is a second case study. Again, our entire focus is on the use of antecedent interventions. So this is a case study and an anchor for us. Again, I'm connecting things to authentic situations, real stories, real circumstances. Same format. I'll go over the background, the scenario, the strategy, the data collection. Annika is was a second grade student at the time who very much disliked math, specifically math word problems. Annika would routinely break pencils, throw pencils, request for the bathroom, tear up her math worksheets, and we found out through scatterplot information that these behaviors were present during math time. And that popped up. It became very visible, became very evident to us over a period of a couple of weeks. She appeared to be motivated by her ability to escape and avoid math. And we got that information through the FBA. And Annika was also extremely interested in cats and kittens, and also very much liked a book series, which I had never heard of until I worked with her, called the Bad Kitty series. And there was one book that she really liked. It was called Bad Kitty Gets a Bath. And we found out that information through the preference assessment. Our strategy was to modify the content of math. to prevent the problem behavior. So this is yet another strategy. We can mitigate. Okay, so go back to Ted Carr again. In the first case study, we talked about avoiding things initially, temporarily. In this story, we're talking about mitigating the circumstances. So we lessen the difficulty. We dial it down as a result of modifying the presentation of the math word problems. So here again, we have contingency dependent stimuli, and we're looking to acquire some antecedent control as a result of that. So what did we do? We incorporated Annika's interest in bad kitty characters and story themes, such as cats wreaking havoc when the cat's in a bad mood. We integrated those characters and scenarios into the math word problems. That's what we did. We just imported. We had that cat sachet right into her math word problems, and that's how we began working with her. In the spirit of team participation, Annika's dad was, mom and dad were both very involved in terms of the development of her behavior intervention plan. All that connects to the team, the appointment of the team, as we've discussed before. And Annika's dad was the one that actually prepared the math word problems. I mean, one of the things that we had to be realistic about in terms of being sensitive to the culture is that the general education teacher, the math teacher, just did not have the time to create specialized materials for Annika. She was very interested in this intervention, very willing to put something new in place. But then Annika's dad stepped forward, and sure enough, he was the one that created all the math word problems. And what ended up happening was the complete eradication of difficulties in math during that period. Now, keep in mind, this is a dynamic process. We had to keep modifying things until we got Annika to the point where her behavior was under really good control, using the typical materials, the natural materials without modification. So this was a bridge plan. So what did we collect data on? We collected data on permanent products, completed worksheets, math word problem worksheets, the percentage of correct problems answered over the number of incorrect problems, and she excelled. She ended up excelling in math. We took data on broken pencils. We took data on requests for bathroom breaks during math and the number of worksheets torn each day. So, of course, the broken pencils and the requests for bathroom and the number of worksheets torn on a day-to-day basis went down to 0. The percentage correct went up to 100% with 0 incorrect answers, and all that information was validated through our data collection process. So there's a second form of antecedent control intervention, things that we did from an antecedent standpoint in order to work more effectively with Annika. Second grade student was presenting a real problem during math, really recruited her interests and integrated her interests right into what we were trying to accomplish in math. Her dad stepped up to the plate and worked in a big way with the team in terms of providing some very valuable assistance. And the strategy resulted in the desired change that we were looking for. So now we got 2 antecedent strategies, right? In one case, we can eliminate the antecedent and avoid the problem completely. However, we ended up doing some good instruction with Anthony in order to have him have successes with Gracie. In the second scenario, we got Annika. The strategy was to modify the content, so we're mitigating something, and that worked out very, very well with her. The third case study has to do with a elderly man. His name was Darius, and I'm going to follow the same format here. I'm going to give you some background, going to give you the scenario and the strategies. So Darius was a war veteran, and he had suffered a mild stroke in his late 80s. And despite being in his late 80s, he was pretty fit individual, and very generally, prior to the stroke, very energetic and engaged and active as well. So subsequent to the stroke, Darius was required to use a walker. So as a result of the stroke, he lost motor control, and his motor abilities were compromised. So he had to use a walker. But he refused. And he had pointed out that it was just too difficult to walk the distance that his occupational therapist was initially requesting. So an occupational therapist was on this team as well. And what she was requiring him to do is just to walk from the bed to the bathroom in his room, which was in a rehabilitation center. But he wouldn't do it. He said it was too difficult. So what's the function? The function of this behavior is escape or avoidance, either one, very clear to us. He also had a very involved family. His wife visited diligently, daily. His daughter visited daily as well. So we had the chance to talk with them, and what we found was that Darius absolutely loved military marching songs, and he also really loved writing cards to his great-grandchildren. I think they're actually great-great-grandchildren, but he loved writing cards to them. He loved military marching songs as well. So, okay, now it gets interesting. Now we know something about his strengths. Strengths as a serviceman, strengths as somebody that an interest in terms of writing cards and maintaining communication with his grandchildren. How do we acquire that information? Well, through a preference assessment, as that was a mechanism for gathering that information. Okay, so what we did was that we changed the task difficulty. This is a strategy. We changed the task difficulty and we made the task more meaningful. What task? Well, we wanted him to walk. We wanted him to walk so he could begin developing his motor skills again and exercising and being able to walk ultimately independently once again. But the only way he was going to do that is by initially cooperating with the use of the walker and then ultimately walking on his own. So that's what we're trying to get. So we changed the level of task difficulty. That's one of the things that we did. But we also introduced something of great interest. We had his wife bring in recorded military marching songs. She brought it in on an iPhone. And we were able to play them off of the iPhone. So at that point, we also talked with the daughter, and we had her purchase an entire stack of just silly children's cards and envelopes and stamps. And we had the daughter put them in the bureau, which was just about 6 feet away from his bed. And at that point, with respect to an intervention, we told Darius that we wanted him to march, and he was going to be able to listen to military marching songs as he marched. Where was he marching to? Well, he was going to march from his bed, using the walker, to the bureau, where he'd be able to open up the bureau drawer, pull out children's cards, march back to his bed, sit down, and write cards to his great-great-grandchildren. And to put them in envelopes, put the stamp on them, put the address on them, and have them mailed off. And then sure enough, as a result of giving him the music, putting the earbuds in his ear, listening to military marching songs, he was able to scooch himself off of the side of the bed, elevate himself on the walker, move that walker 6 feet across the room to the bureau. Why? Because there was a reason. Why? Why was there a reason? Because there was children's cards there. Why would he want to do that? Because those children's cards were conditioned reinforcers for him. And he took out a card. He went back to his bed. Why was he motivated to go back to the bed? Because he wanted to sit down and write the card out. So we brought it all together. And as a result of that, we progressively had him marching and moving for greater and greater lengths of well, greater durations, but also greater distances as well. And Darius did quite well. He ultimately ended up not having to use the walker, and he returned home after a period of time. And this was one of the interventions that we used in order to achieve that very important, socially significant outcome. So I'm going to ask you at this point, what kind of data would be appropriate to be collecting on this kind of intervention? And I'm not going to tell you on this one. I'm going to let you think about that because you are getting to the point now where you are needing me less and less with respect to coming up with answers for these kinds of issues. So I'm transferring it over to you because just as I said, what we want with the individuals that we work with is to make them self-sufficient and to promote self-efficacy and self-determination and self-control. I want to do the same thing with you. So you decide what data collection method could be used for this kind of case study. Okay, at this point I'm going to put the bright light on what's referred to as contingency-independent stimuli. These are antecedent events that are not dependent on consequences of behavior for developing what's referred to as an evocative effect or an abative effect. Motivation to do something is not the same as discriminative stimuli. So we just got done talking about SDs and discriminative stimuli, and we talked about interventions that we can use to manage antecedents in the environment to kind of create some kind of change. But there's another category of antecedent, and this category of antecedent was discussed by Skinner in just an exceptional book referred to as Science and Human Behavior. If you ever have the opportunity to read this book, I just highly recommend that you do so. And in that book, there's 3 chapters on motivation. One is referred to as deprivation and satiation. It's from chapter 9. In chapter 10, there's a chapter dedicated to emotion. And then in chapter 11, aversion, avoidance, and anxiety, all having to do with motivation. Just a great volume. If you have the opportunity to read it, I encourage you to do so. So with this category, the antecedent itself affects behavior. The antecedent itself affects specifically the behavior-consequence relations. And we refer to this as motivating operations. And these are contingency independent. So what's motivating the person is not dependent on consequences that have followed the presentation of that antecedent. So it's not like the SD. It's the antecedent itself that's affecting the behavior-consequence relations. So let me just give you one example. I'm going to go back to Skinner's book chapter 9 on deprivation and satiation. If you, for example, are in a state of deprivation, then that deprivation will produce motivation. And as a result of that deprivation, you will engage in specific behaviors, and then things in your environment, reinforces in your environment, increase in value as a result of your state of deprivation. I'm just going to give you a quick story on that. I remember hiking in the state of Maine in New England, and I went with a friend whose name is also Michael, and we went out for the entire day, and we failed to bring sufficient food, and we just didn't bring a lot of food at all. I had plenty to drink, but was very short on the food. And I recall descending the mountain and feeling extremely hungry. And as we get down to the base of the mountain, in the big parking lot at the base of the mountain, which was a relief to finally arrive at, there was parked in that lot an ice cream truck. And now I'm not somebody that at all eats ice cream. I just don't. It's not something that I necessarily prefer. However, as a result of the state of deprivation, that ice cream truck and the content of that ice cream truck increased tremendously in value. So that ice cream truck became coveted. I wanted the ice cream from that ice cream truck, and I wanted it fast. So as a result of the motivating operation, the state of deprivation, something in my environment, a reinforcer, and I don't eat ice cream much, but it is a reinforcer. It increased in value, and it increased in value a lot. That is what's referred to as a motivating operation. So once again, this is an effect that is achieved not as a result of being dependent on consequences and contingencies. It is independent. The state of deprivation is independent of consequences. So as a result of my deprivation, something in my environment increased in value in terms of my motivation to achieve it. So the motivating operation changes how much you want something. So it doesn't shift or have implications for the availability of something, like the discriminative stimulus, or the chances of getting something as a result of the discriminative stimulus, the SD. The motivating operation changes how much you want something. So as a state of deprivation, I wanted ice cream a lot. Now there are different categories of motivating operations, one of which is referred to as unconditioned. It doesn't have to be learned. So deprivation and satiation would be two things that would be unlearned motivating operations. There are other motivating operations that are conditioned and they are learned. That will be a discussion for another time. Now it's time to introduce you to another luminary in the field, and that is Dr. Jack Michael. And I want to introduce him here because he has been prolific in his writings and in terms of the motivating operations, specifically the establishing operation, and that material is available to you should you choose to be reading in that category. He's a researcher, professor, and an author in the field of experimental analysis of behavior. And if you have the chance to do some reading of his articles, I highly encourage you to do that. So let's take a look at the motivating operations, and let's see what we can do here in terms of case studies. Let's see what interventions look like when I have those motivating operations in mind. So by way of definition, specifically, the motivating operation refers to an event or stimulus condition that alters first, the value of the consequences that act as types of reinforcement or punishment. The motivating operation has a value-altering effect. And then second, the probability of behaviors that have been previously associated with such consequences are altered as well. So the motivating operation has what's referred to as a behavior altering effect. So when we're talking about motivating operations, it impacts the value of things in our environment, like reinforcers and punishers, and also affects and impacts the probability of behaviors that have previously associated with such consequences. So that is the formal definition of a motivating operation. Okay, so let's take a look at some case studies here where I manipulated the motivating operation for an individual. Okay, once again, the same format will be followed. I'll touch on the background, I'll discuss the scenario, the strategy, and the data collection methods as well. So, fictitious name once again, Stephen, 16-year-old boy diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was also a fire setter and was admitted to a 45-day hospital-based diagnostic program where he functioned as just a day patient. He was brought into the hospital on a day-to-day basis. He was an outpatient client. So with respect to the scenario, Stephen was transported to the hospital on a bus each morning. However, upon arrival, he refused to exit that bus and became extremely violent and injured people as a result. He put himself and others at risk for serious injury on a daily basis, and at times it required 3 people to support him. And there were times where he had to be physically immobilized as a result of his aggression. So based on the FBA results, we found that Stephen appeared to be reinforced by attention. Attention from multiple staff, attention from people. That's what appeared to maintain his aggressive behavior. So we got the FBA results, and that's what it's suggesting. Now we also did preference assessment and strength-based assessment as well. And what we found was that Stephen was very interested in high-performance cars, Maseratis, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and he was extremely knowledgeable about all aspects of performance, and quite frankly, he liked to demonstrate his knowledge. He liked to talk about cars, liked to talk about high-performance cars, and he would demonstrate that. And he was determined as a result, the information was determined as a result of the preference assessment that we did. So the strategy that we used is what's referred to as a high probability, low probability procedure, also referred to as high P, low P procedure. And this is a contingency independent stimuli and antecedent intervention. So this is different from manipulating discriminative stimuli or working with SDs. Here we're more interested in working with motivating operations. So once again, contingency independent stimuli. That's the approach that we're taking. Specifically, the way the high P, low P procedure works is that there's a presentation of a series of highly desirable demands. What does that mean? Well, things with a high probability that'll follow, that'll do. What kinds of things? Well, if you talk to Stephen about cars, for example, high performance cars, there's a high probability that he'll answer you and engage in a very appropriate way. And the high probability, low probability sequence involves first presenting those kinds of demands that will likely result in his cooperation and compliance, and then follow that by something that's less desirable. What was less desirable? Getting off the bus, walking off the bus, without being aggressive. Okay, so our intervention, our strategy. We purchase car and driver magazines, especially those that were really featuring Maseratis and Lamborghinis and Ferraris. And then we took a staff member, naive staff member, somebody genuinely naive, didn't know anything at all about high performance cars. And we had that person greet Stephen on the bus in the morning with magazine in hand, and the staff person began asking him questions, legitimate questions about high performance cars, Maseratis, Lamborghinis, Ferraris. And sure enough, Stephen happily answered these questions. So that was a high probability command. We posed a demand, asked him to answer questions. There was a high probability that he would comply. Sure enough, he did. He really liked discussing the cars. And the other thing I should note was that the car discussion changed on a daily basis. So we didn't stay with the same car, the same questions. It was varied. He was a very smart guy, so he was going to do something where we were just boring him with the same questions on a day-to-day basis. So that varied from one day to the next. Then the staff person, as a result of establishing that sequence of delivering the high probability command sequence, ultimately posed the low probability command. That is, walk off the bus. However, we can walk and talk at the same time. Now, this intervention reduced the value of the reinforcement he received for noncompliance and for aggression. Because he was getting all the attention that he wanted. This staff person was coming and immediately engaged, immediately began talking about things. Talking about what? Well, things that he really liked talking about. High-performance cars, Maseratis, Lamborghinis, and Ferraris. He really liked that. Getting all sorts of attention as a result of doing that. So that intervention reduced the value of what he would get for being non-compliant and for being aggressive. He was getting what he needed, what he wanted out of the interaction with the genuinely naive staff person asking all these questions. He was getting everything he needed out of that. He was getting all the attention that he wanted. So it decreased the value of the alternate. What alternate? Being aggressive, being non-compliant. So you get a reduction in the value of that behavior, and an increase in the value of his continued engagement with the staff person. This is what's referred to as a high probability, low probability, or high P, low P procedure. And it squarely falls into the category of managing motivating operations, and it was extremely successful. So the data collected, we did latency measure. Remember I told you in previous conversations and modules that a latency is that time between the presentation of a stimulus and the opportunity to do something, and then the person's actual follow-through. So we did latency measures at baseline in terms of Stephen getting off the bus, and then we looked at the latency once we had the high P, low P intervention in place, and sure enough, that latency significantly shortened. We also measured the frequency of aggression as well. It's a discrete behavior. It was very simple to get a frequency count on, and that was the other measure that we had in place. We also had Stephen using a self-recording and self-management system. So once again, we put a lot of emphasis on people, Stephen specifically, tracking his own behavior. So that intervention was in place as well, self-management intervention, that is. Okay, one other case study for us. This one involves Asher, fifth grade student who was gifted, very high intelligence, had a diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. For the first hour in class, as determined by the scatter plot in terms of time of day, he frequently disrupted the class with really large, loud announcements and some very esoteric information that they wanted to share with people. So I had these proclamations that were actually stigmatizing because he became somebody that the other students would make fun of. He seemed to be motivated by attention from, not attention from one individual, but attention from an entire peer group, so an entire group of individuals. So the scenario is that Asher attends what's referred to as a STEM magnet school, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM magnet school. And he was fascinated with 18th century England and the customs and the people in 18th century England, and that was his fascination. We got that information by way of the preference assessment. And his classroom disruptions occurred on average about 3 times in the first hour of day, on average. Unfortunately, Asher was also being bullied by other students as a result of his behavior. So what we put in place is what's referred to as a non-contingent reinforcement program, NCR, non-contingent reinforcement. And this is what it involved. We appointed Asher as the town crier. That was his designation. And town criers are something from 18th century England that he had read about. And frankly, the students in this magnet school, very bright people, they understood town criers as well. So we gave Asher permission to go from one classroom to another during the first hour of every morning. And we put him on what's referred to as a fixed time schedule. So he came in, and independent of anything that he did, that's why it's called non-contingent reinforcement, we just allowed him to go make announcements to the other classes, which he really enjoyed. He very much liked to do. And more importantly, the students in the classes were very receptive of it too, because he was delivering information that they would want to know, early dismissals, special events that were occurring. So Asher would go off, make an announcement, come back to the room, and then on a non-contingent basis, send him off again. Go make another announcement, but this time go do it to the secretaries that are in the office, and give them this information. He would come back to the room. We'd send him off again on this fixed time schedule, and it was independent of his behavior. So even if he was displaying maladaptive behavior, that was not the requirement that he be well behaved in order to have the privilege to do this. This is a non-contingent reinforcement strategy. So there again, we've manipulated a motivating operation through the use of non-contingent reinforcement. Why did it work? And it did. Well, it worked because Asher was receiving all the attention from large groups that he was looking for. And then that devalued the kind of attention he was getting as a result of doing stigmatizing things in the classroom, making his own proclamations or sharing esoteric information. So this strategy, non-contingent reinforcement, works as a result of the person acquiring reinforcers. And then that in turn results in the devaluing of the reinforcers acquired by displaying maladaptive behavior. In terms of the data that we collected, we looked at classroom disruptions. What disruptions? Loud voice, talking out of turn in the classroom. And here's yet another success story. Okay, so we got two categories of interventions. We've got antecedent control interventions, all having to do with the manipulation of antecedents in the environment, and then we got another class of interventions that involve motivating operations. And what I'm trying to do here is to build your own skill set in terms of your abilities. So let's end with some questions. What are the four basic functions of behavior? Well, they're sensory, escape, attention, and tangible. Who should be involved in the development of interventions? The team of stakeholders, including the family. Is an SD a contingency dependent stimulus or contingency independent? Well, it's contingency dependent. And then does motivating operation signal the availability of something? No, motivation operation changes the value of reinforcers or punishers. Is a motivating operation a contingency dependent or independent stimulus? It is contingency independent. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the module and I hope you enjoyed the case studies because I think as a result of using case studies, it really puts substance behind a lot of these concepts that we've talked about. We pulled in preference assessment, we pulled in the FBA process, pulled in the ABC analysis, we pulled in the scatter plot analysis, we pulled in this whole conversation about behavior intervention plans, and this is how it gets translated. You know, we begin looking at possibilities as a result of interventions, collaborating with the team, putting things in place, monitoring and evaluating the effect. And fortunately, the case studies I got to share with you today were all successes, and they were specifically picked for that very reason. So thank you once again for your attention, and we will pick up again in the next module.